Es para mí un gran honor y un gran placer introducir al Premio Nobel de Economía 2015, Sir Angus Deaton. Muy bienvenido a Colombia, muchas gracias por su presencia, profesor Deaton. El profesor Deaton obtuvo su licenciatura en Economía, su maestría y su doctorado en la Universidad de Cambridge. Actualmente es profesor de Economía y Asuntos Internacionales en la Woodrow Wilson School of Public International Affairs y del Departamento de Economía de la Universidad de Princeton. Es miembro de la British Academy, la American Academy of Arts and Sciences y de la Econometric Society. Sus principales áreas de investigación son la salud, el bienestar y el desarrollo económico. Recibió el Premio Nobel de Economía en 2015 por su brillante análisis sobre el consumo, la pobreza y el bienestar social. Y es autor del muy importante libro comentado esta mañana varias veces, titulado El Gran Escape. Bienvenido, profesor Deaton. Muchas gracias por su presencia en Colombia.
Thank you. Just start this up. Thank you very, very much indeed. And it's an enormous honor to be here at this historic moment for Colombia. It was a great privilege this morning to hear your president talking about economics and about the peace process, and I wish you the very best of the future. And I'm going to try to talk about some things that I think are relevant for that. And here are the three themes I'm going to talk about today. So in 45 minutes, I'm going to first talk about the history of the world. And then when I finish talking about the history of the world, I'm going to talk about inequality and taxes. And then when I finish talking about inequality and taxes, I'm going to talk about how to help the poor or how not to help the poor. So I think I'd better get on with it. There's a lot to talk about in a very short time. So let me start with the histories of the world and where we are today. For many of us, the world looks like a very difficult, uncertain place. It's not so true here, but in the countries of the OECD and in China and not really in India, economic growth has been slowing. The recovery from the Great Recession of 2008 has been much, much slower than anyone would have expected, and seems not to have happened yet. Within many, many countries, though not in Colombia, there's rising income inequality and wealth inequality over a long period, which is worrying a lot of people. At the same time, in Europe and in North America, we're seeing a breakdown or a threatened breakdown of familiar political arrangements. For instance, with the Brexit vote, with the emergence of Donald Trump's presidential candidate, and the sense that politics is really changing in a very serious way. In a way, here in Colombia, you have the opposite of that, which is you have the hopes of a new political arrangement and a true democratic future in Colombia. So when I think about those uncertainties of today, it's very easy, especially from the European and North American perspective, to get very depressed and think the world is in a very bad place. But it really does help to think about how far we've come and how much better the world is than it used to be. I want to say a few things first about well-being, development, and freedom. There are many different meanings of the word well-being. I think that's why it's become very popular, because everybody can attach their own meaning to the word well-being. I tend to think of it as all of the things that make life worth living, that people have a reason to value in their lives, and there's a list of some of them. Material well-being, money, wealth, goods and services. Health is incredibly important, morbidity and mortality, education and civic participation. It's no accident that all of those have been discussed extensively this morning. Some people like to just make a list of those things and see how we're doing on each one of those categories. There's also another sort of category, which is to ask people how well their lives are going. How satisfied are you with your life? And I'll show you the answers to some of those questions. Because it's possible for people to feel their lives are going very well, even if objectively some of these other things are not going so well. Amartya Sen, in his famous book, Development is Freedom, has argued that all of these things are part of broad economic development and of what it means, what freedom truly means. If we go back in history, and this is something, again, that came up this morning, which I very, very much agree with, which is the great episodes of human progress, the things that really, really changed the world, have tended to cause great inequality. So let me say a little more about that. These great episodes of human progress are what in my book I've called the Great Escape, from destitution, ill health, and premature mortality to the long life and high material living standards that so much of the world has today. Colombia is about halfway there on this scale, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute. Governance has improved throughout the world over the last 200 years and very much over the last 50 years, and democracy is much more widespread across the world. Steven Pinker has written about the large-scale reductions in violence. And so actually what's happening here in Colombia now is part of a much broader global trend towards more complete democracy and less violence, more turning to the ballot box and less to the bullets. And you can see Colombia as part of that broad trend that's been happening in the world. It's come late, but it's never too late. There's been huge increases in education around the world, especially for girls. And I also believe, and I'll show you some evidence for this, that people actually know their lives are better, and they know they have better lives. So all of these progresses have actually made people feel better about their lives than otherwise would have been the case. So many places have made the transition that Colombia is making today. Now, the whole point about progress is that only a few escape at a time. So, it would be great if whenever there were progress, everybody got it at once. But that's not the way the world works. You can't legislate that. It's a few entrepreneurs or a few people who see the way forward first. And then that generates an enormous amount of inequality. And in the end, that should be good for everybody. But in the short run, it generates a lot of inequality. The most famous divergence, the most famous episode of progress and of inequality is what historians call the Great Divergence. There was sustained economic growth for the first time in human history that began in Northwest Europe between 1750 and 1850, and that sowed the increases. That's what the beginning of all the good things that have happened around the world since then. But what, of course, it did was those countries, Britain, Scandinavia, Holland, moved away from the rest of the world, opening up huge gaps. And those huge gaps have never really closed. The huge amount of global inequality between countries, really goes all the way back to 1750 to 1800 and so on. Now, you might say, you can, the people who hate inequality would say, maybe we should have stopped the Industrial Revolution. Maybe we should have stopped the health revolution. That's an incredibly stupid thing to say. So you can't at the same time bemoan inequality and say progress is good, but we hate inequality. That's just nonsense, because you can't have one without the other. Today, of course, other countries have caught up, not uniformly, and these gaps still remain. So the huge gaps between countries are still there, even though, and not everybody realizes this, if you take all the people in the world and take each person as a unit, the inequality across all the people in the world has been getting smaller. even if within countries it's getting bigger. Now that sounds crazy. How could every country be getting more unequal and the world be getting less unequal? And the answer, of course, is because two huge countries, India and China, have moved from something like total destitution up to something like the global middle class, and that's brought 2.5 billion people with them from the bottom up to the middle, and that's what's closing global inequality among persons. All right. The book is based on an analogy with a movie, which some of you will have seen. Usually when I look around the room and talk about this, people who are my age or older have seen this movie, and the younger people have no idea what I'm talking about. But this is a great, great movie for my generation, which had Steve McQueen in it. And it's about an escape from a German prisoner of war camp. And the Germans had put a whole bunch of people together who'd escaped many times before and put very high security around them. And then, of course, eventually they escape. That's what the movie's about. And the movie is about human ingenuity, the desire for freedom in very difficult situations, and what people will do in order to escape, to get that freedom. That's a very, very important idea, which is that people want to be free, they want to develop, they want to be healthy, they want to be rich. And we're never going to choke that off. So even when you're in the worst possible times and things look really bad, there's always that force for good that's really there pushing the world. Now, many people escape through a tunnel in the movie, about 200 people. And you could say, well, that created great inequality because a lot of people didn't escape. And before they were all in jail, whereas some of them, now of them were free, and some of them were still in the prison. Now, of course, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So maybe I'm pushing this too hard, but you get the general idea. The final point, of course, in the book, or the movie, if those of you who've seen the movie, is the movie does not end well. Because a few of the hundreds of people who escape actually get home, but most of them are recaptured by the Germans and shot. So the Great Escape comes to a very bad end. And people said, well, you can't use the book as an analogy. You can't use the movie as an analogy because look what happened in the movie. You don't want to talk about that. Well, but there have been great escapes in the past which came to a bad end. If you read the history of China, for instance, in the 11th century, there were cities that had black smoke everywhere with theaters all over the place, and books were so cheap that everybody could read them, and that came to a shuddering halt. So 250 years in the span of human history is not a huge amount of time. So we don't want to get too complacent and think that we can never go back, we can never lose what we have. I don't think we will, but the threats that are out there on the horizon today, I think, are real enough. The other thing I want to emphasize is that it is about health as well as wealth, that life expectancy began to rise in Britain in the middle of the 18th century in parallel with the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment was probably the fundamental cause behind both of those, and this led to inequality in life chances, not just between countries, but within Britain. The better off people who could afford the new medicines, many of which came from Latin America actually, their life expectancy was extended. And the poorer people didn't get that, even though there'd been no difference in life expectancy for hundreds of years before that. So once again, we got inequality, this time in life chances, and once again, it was a really good thing because it meant those new cures came to everybody after a while. So once again, inequality is good. So let me show you some pictures of the last 50 years which show this in progress. So this is a picture which was originally drawn by the demographer Sam Preston a very long time ago. This is a modern version of it. This graph shows income along the horizontal axis, which is GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, for those of you who know what that means, but it means the prices have been adjusted across countries. And on the vertical axis is life expectancy, which goes from about 30 in the worst places on the planet up to almost 80 in Japan today. The circles, each circle is a country, And the area of the circle is proportional to the population of the country. So the big blobs are like the United States at the top right there, and the very big blobs in the middle are India and China. I'll show you Colombia in a minute. If you're looking for it, you can't see it on this picture, but you will in a minute. All right? There's two lines here, one for 1960 and one for 50 years later in 2010. And the arrow is the summary of this graph, which is I call the onward and upward graph, meaning everything's getting better over time, income is going up, life expectancy is going up. And even in countries that, and part of it comes with higher income, so as you slide up along the curve, but over time too, the curve itself has moved up. So even countries that didn't have any growth had life expectancy improvement. Lots of them in Africa, for instance, where the economic gods were not very kind, but people live longer than they used to live. Those things are not automatically connected to one another. That shows the progress. Now let me put Colombia on that picture. You can see these are the two red dots, one for 1960 and one for 2010. And you can see that Colombia is now about the same on life expectancy and income as China is, and has made considerable progress over that period. So that's a good thing. But if you want to see what the champions have done, and this comparison already came up this morning, here's what happened to Korea. I can flip back and forward. That's Colombia, Korea. So Korea started from a lower position than Colombia did in both income and life expectancy, and now is way up among the rich countries. And maybe now with Colombia joining the OECD, the next time I come back and talk, 50 years from now, maybe my son will come and talk. We'll see Colombia up there with Korea too. In the world as a whole, I wanted to show you, these are World Bank figures for the number of people living on less than $2 a day or $1.90 a day. And you can see there's just been this amazing change. I mean, this picture starts in 1980, finishes in 2012. And, you know, there were 2 billion people. These are in millions. So there's 2,000 million people, 2 billion people living in abject poverty in 1980. And that's down to less than 1 billion now. That is one of the greatest achievements in human history. I mean, that's just nothing like that has ever happened before. As collective citizens of the world, we ought to be extremely proud of that. People say, well, it's all China. Well, a lot of it's China, but it's not all China, because if you take the world without China, you can see over the last 20 years, been a remarkable decrease. And even in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the sort of worst performing part of the world, it's been flat, but is now really turning down, or at least if you believe the data about Africa, which who knows. And then I promised to say something about happiness. And happiness, this is a picture from Gallup data, and it's the same sort of picture. It's got GDP along the bottom. Each blob, the area of the blob is the population of the country. The vertical axis is what we call the ladder of life. Now, the ladder of life says, imagine a ladder. The bottom is marked 0. The top is marked 10. 0 is the worst possible life you could imagine for yourself. 10 is the best possible life you could imagine for yourself. Where would you put yourself on this ladder now? Okay? So you can see that if you're living in Sierra Leone, people on average are reporting about 3. If you live in Denmark, which is the world champion in all these things, people report nearly 8. And the remarkable thing here, which not everybody claims, and it was referred to this morning, everybody believes, is that as income goes up, this ladder measure goes up with it. Notice this is a log scale, so each tick on this, you're doubling income. So it's not just income, you're going from 800 to 3,200 to 12,800, and each mark is a quadrupling of income as you go up that scale. So it's harder and harder and harder to get happier with income as you get richer, but it still goes up. So the richer countries are still above the poorer countries. Now there's 2 points in this graph which are sort of interesting. One is the Chinese and East Asian countries always do very badly on this. They really report themselves. There's China. You can see Japan, Hong Kong, Korea in there, Singapore even, are way below this line relative to where you would expect them to be. And who knows what that is? It may just be that the Chinese character is such that if you ask people who they're happy, they say, no, not me, I couldn't possibly be happy. Where I grew up in Scotland, happiness is thought of as sort of a disease. You know, if you're happy, there's something seriously wrong with you and you'd better go off to a hospital somewhere and be cured of that. But Latin America has always been celebrated, these are the green countries here, for the fact that people always say really good things when you ask them questions about this. So you can see there's Costa Rica, which does much, much better than its income would expect it to do. And there's Brazil, and Panama is the tiny one you can see there, and Costa Rica and Guatemala. Colombia, interestingly enough, is not that great. And it's sort of almost on the line, maybe a little bit above the line. So it might be that you guys are like the Chinese, you don't like to say you're doing very well, or the Scots. Or maybe it's just that there's something been happening in Colombia and we wouldn't have to search too hard to see what it is, which is bringing people down a little than if you were Costa Rica or something of the sort. But these come along with the general notion, and none of this would suggest that health or material well-being is bad for you, some people seem to think. Finally, this is a measure of world inequality, and what you can see here is that these are different measures, and if I had time I would explain them all. This is a really hard thing to measure. The one I like the best is the WDI 2011 ICP. I could tell you what these are the latest data, and those are showing what's happened over the last 30 years or so, and this just shows this declining world inequality, which is largely driven by the great success of India and China over that period. So, you know, if I scared you at the beginning by thinking the world is a terrible, crazy, difficult place, I hope by now you're feeling a little better about it, that the world as a whole is not quite so bad. All right, but what do we think about this increasing inequality within countries? What should you think about it in a country like Colombia that has an enormous amount of inequality? So I have some not very well-connected thoughts about this. I really envy Piketty his vision, right? He knows the answer to everything, how it all hangs together. And I've never been able to bring myself to that set of consistent beliefs, which may sometimes be a good thing, I think. But anyway, it would be nice to be wiser. So let me tell you some thoughts I have about inequality. So, you know, one of the things that is really, well, here are some of the things I'm going to talk about. That within countries, economic growth has been, I mean, a lot of what's wrong with inequality, rising inequality, is the fact that growth has been going down at the same time. And, you know, if growth were going on at the rate it used to go on, we wouldn't, I think, be nearly so worried about the increase in inequality. You've got countries like Latin America, including Colombia, where inequality is very high, though it's true throughout the world in agriculture and primary commodity producing countries, especially with unequal land distribution, inequality tends to be very high. And so, you know, Colombia is not that exceptional in that role. And let me talk a little bit about the role of taxation, which came up this morning. Should we be using taxation to reduce inequality? Or, as I will argue, the important thing is not to let groups fall behind. So why should we care about inequality? Now, many people think inequality by and of itself is unjust. And I don't think the philosophical literature supports that. And I actually don't think that my life is worse just because someone else has more money than I do. If I were really poor, and suffering, that would be a different matter altogether. So I think the general philosophical consensus among philosophers who think about these things is that poverty is a really problem, and we have an obligation to assist the poor. And I think all philosophers would agree on that. But there's no corresponding obligation to help someone who has a little less than someone else, provided neither of them are poor. So, I mean, that's the sort of position I'm coming to. Prioritarianism, which is the philosophy that argues that money matters less to the rich on the margin than to the poor, so that transferring money from the rich to the less rich increases social welfare. And that is something I was brought up on. I mean, Tony Atkinson in 1969 wrote a very famous paper about that, about the measurement of inequality and how you should think about inequality, which came to be known by the philosophers, especially Parfit, as prioritarianism. And this is just this idea of this diminishing marginal social utility. You know, rich people at the margin are worth less than poor people, or poorer people. So that, yet the prioritarianism has been deeply built into our theories of taxation, from Atkinson, Merlees, and Piketty too. I mean, Piketty's book never really tells you why he dislikes inequality so much. And I have read all 800, I don't know how many pages, and looking for that. And, you know, it's just like, and I think it's just this prioritarianism. It's this belief that if you took money away from the rich and gave it to the poor, or you gave it to people who were poorer, that would make the world a better place. And I don't think there's any real philosophical justification for that. Of course, everybody recognizes the disincentive effects, the collection costs, the corruption that comes with it, all the things that we were talking about this morning. But the philosophical premise of why you're taxing is important, I think. And I don't think prioritarianism really works to it. So I'm really just offering you that. There's much in Piketty that I really like, and I think the world of patrimonial capitalism that he talks about is not a world that I would want to live in, or I think many people would want to live in. And if, as his dystopian vision that you're going to go there comes to pass, I think it would make us very, very unhappy. But let me hark back to what I was saying about the Great Escape, that inequality also reflects productive incentives as well as successful innovation. So a phrase I like to use is getting rich in the national interest is no crime. I mean, if entrepreneurs or innovators come up with new things that benefit us all, who is to begrudge them getting very rich and inequality increasing? I mean, I just can't bring myself to think of that as being a bad thing. Progress generates inequality, as in the Great Escape. But then there's this issue as to whether inequality might be instrumentally harmful, so that once you've got all this inequality, does it do bad things? And to me, what I've come to be more worried about, and more so since I wrote the book, is about unproductive rent-seeking, the blocking of innovation by successful firms, of people using government to enrich themselves at the expense of other people, at the expense of the nation as a whole. And that sort of rent-seeking, which generates an enormous amount of inequality too, seems to me iniquitous. And that is what we ought to be attacking, not just attacking people who are rich because they're rich. It's you've got to really stop people. Many people feel that politics doesn't work for them anymore. In Colombia, including more people in politics is obviously an important key to the future. In the US, there's been this set of issues I've been working on with my colleague and wife, Ann Case, in poorly educated white people, non-Hispanic whites in the US, have been doing very badly and feel that they are seriously unrepresented in politics. And much of that is to do with the rise of Mr. Trump.